Salutations! Today we ask if the US could invade and conquer Russia all on its own if it had to. The reason for such an unlikely event would always have to be unrealistic, but it's a way to compare the two sides' military power in a real environment. So let's just say, for the sake of the argument, Ukraine splits, Russia takes the eastern half, and no one but the US wants to stop Russia from succeeding in that. Just what could the US all alone do? Could it ever reach Ukraine? Russia and the US are two superpowers. Imagine you could control either and see how their war might play out. In Conflict of Nations, which is sponsoring this video, you can do just that. You can fight up to 64 other players in real time. The game is set in the early 21st century. There are modern-day weapons and technology abound, and you must take over the world. Build your own strategy, combine dozens of different unit types and fight for world domination. The game is fully cross-platform. Play with the same account on both PC and mobile. And Binka viewers, listen up. Click the link below and get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription in-game for free. Offer is available for 30 days, so hurry up. Back to our hypothetical conflict. Our rules state no allies and no nukes. The US will be able to use its bases in other countries, ones that it already has, but the US is still faced with a huge hurdle: distance. It has a lot of bases around the world and a lot of pre-positioned forces, but those are all still scattered all around the world. 3 areas contain most of America's overseas troops. South Korea and Japan are one. Another is the Middle East and Afghanistan, with over 60,000 US personnel. And then there's Europe. The UK, Germany, Poland, Italy and Spain account for some 60,000 troops alone. Those are not all ground troops though. Air Force and Navy personnel make up a lot of those numbers. So what could the US do if other countries are against the whole intervention? Trying to go through Germany and Poland would be a political no-go that might even lead to war with those countries. Turkey is angry with the US to begin with, so any access to the Black Sea is out of the question. If the US tries to fly some troops over third-party countries and into Ukraine, that would be but a token force. In the immediate vicinity, there's 1 airborne brigade in Italy and roughly 1.5 brigade worth of ground troops in Germany, Poland and other nearby countries. Airlift might be organized for those to relocate to western Ukraine. Some of the ample Middle East force numbers could also be rushed in, but flights over Turkey would not be likely. Special forces and the airborne brigade would probably be sent in first. It has to be said that moving an entire brigade by airlift is terribly inefficient and demanding, especially an armored brigade. It would literally take more or less the majority of the US Air Force total transport plane fleet to airlift a single Stryker brigade, which doesn't have heavy vehicles like tanks. The US transport plane fleet, however large it may seem, is not designed to quickly ferry entire brigades around. And even if there were no other needs around, maintenance requirements mean at least a fifth of the fleet would be unavailable. So just flying in the forces from those nearby bases would likely take a week, since transport planes need to be organized and prepositioned, turnaround times need to be included and so on. And all for a few brigades worth of troops. And all of that is likely impossible to do as well, because if the US tried to put more troops into Ukraine, Russia would react by shooting down anything that moves over Ukraine. So the US would need to establish air superiority first, which would take time as well, further slowing down the airlift effort. The US has many more planes than Russia on paper, but locally the US simply lacks the numbers and bases to fight the Russian Air Force and air defenses right away. The biggest US air bases in Europe are shown on the screen. In addition to that, the US does operate from some smaller bases, which are usually operated by the host nation as well. And anyway, if the US planes did start to arrive in some of those bases, the likelihood of Russian strikes on those bases increases substantially. Politically, using all those bases would be a very hard sell. The initial force numbers would thus not be in America's favor. The US would have the technology edge, true, but Russia would also have ground-based air defenses. As soon as US troops are on the ground in Ukraine, who knows what that would cause, including the whole of Ukraine being under threat. Realistically, that's what NATO is for, but we said we wanted to explore if the US could do it all by itself. Perhaps the biggest issue of all would be sheer distance. There is no way the US could operate from its British bases without aerial tankers, which would add more time to deployment and would lower sortie rates. Basically, by flying longer to reach the combat theater, local US numbers over Ukraine would be even smaller than previously shown. The two big circles show that even bases in Germany and Italy would have the planes at the very edge of their capability, range-wise, without aerial refueling. The small circles represent Russian S-400 SAM against high-flying planes. Interestingly, that northern S-400 means Russia's own exclave of Kaliningrad would very much be threatened, as it is also isolated. In a real-world scenario, Russia would likely go through the Baltic states to reinforce Kaliningrad. As it stands, Russia would simply be pouring many more forces into or near Ukraine as needed, compared to the US. The tyranny of distance would not suit the US. So how would the US even bring its numerous CONUS units? As always, by ships. That too takes time, of course. Preparations for the Gulf War, hauling in hundreds of thousands of troops, took months. There's one example of a heavy armored division being taken from the Low Countries through the Med and to the Middle East in 2003. Over 16,000 troops, 3 armored brigades, 1 aviation brigade, artillery unit and a sustainment brigade. 9 rather large ships were needed to carry it all, and it took some 2 weeks. Distance from the US to Kaliningrad is a little over half of that example, but there would be no place to put those forces. First, an amphibious or airborne assault would be needed to even secure a port for such huge ships. Russia has some 3 brigades worth of ground troops in Kaliningrad to begin with, and could reinforce it with more, and could bomb the ports until the US achieves air superiority. And while losing Kaliningrad might shame the Russians, it would not do much to help the US reach Russia proper or reach Ukraine. Going after St. Petersburg or Murmansk would basically be impossible. Russian troop numbers there would be high, upward of 30 brigades worth, fairly nearby. The entire US airborne and marine assets are less, even if they all somehow manage to reach the Russian shores there. All those units usually lack heavy armor and firepower, compared to a proper army brigade. So in actual equivalents of Russian brigade terms, the total force would be closer to 24 brigades. That may seem like a lot, but the US has no way of actually landing so many units in a short period of time. Not all marine battalions are meant to do amphibious landings. Nor does the US Navy have ships for all of them at once. The fleet is the biggest in the world, but assuming 75% availability due to maintenance, the first wave might hope to land some 30,000 troops, roughly equivalent to 7 or 8 Russian army brigades. Realistically, not all or perhaps even not most would survive to reach the shore. Such massive landing fleets would likely be detected, and air superiority would be unlikely so far away from US bases, even if more planes are brought in from CONUS, and even if almost all US carriers are used. The US Air Force would be hard-pressed to airdrop more than 2 airborne brigades per day with all the supplies they need, assuming transport planes could survive and get back to their bases. The Russian military is pretty much geared towards Europe as it is. Some 2/3 of all ground force troops are stationed in the 2 Russian military regions bordering Ukraine, and most of their units are stationed fairly close to the borders. Realistically, it would take US months to organize. During that time, Russia would be pretty much mobilized and pretty much all of their ground army would be manning their western borders. If the US tried to land anywhere in western Russia, it would end up in a disaster, with the possible exception of Kaliningrad, due to the very specific rules of this scenario. If the US would magically be able to place all its planes close to Russia, the Russians would not likely be able to control their borders. The overall numbers and sheer quality edge is clearly on the US side. Russia is devoid of 5th-generation fighters and has low numbers of modern air-to-air missiles. The US has also close to 1,500 fighters with modern AESA radars, while Russia has some 460 with various phased array radars. Bombers-wise, the two are essentially tied in numbers, but US bombers are larger and have greater range on average. The Tupolov's 22M are mostly suited for anti-shipping or a defensive role, and the stealthy B-2 has no Russian equivalent. But because of geography and lack of bases, the only place where the US might actually achieve numerical superiority is in the Far East, far from Ukraine. There, in Korea and Japan, the US already has a lot of bases, with ample room to house additional fighters. That could fairly quickly and easily be doubled, and then it's a matter of a few months until 5 or 6 carriers also arrive. The US might thus fairly easily field over 800 fighters in the Pacific area. Russia could try to match that, but the Russian Far East has fewer bases and airports, so some of the more isolated areas, like Kamchatka, might well be quite hard to defend. The attacker would be choosing where to strike, and Russia hasn't got enough bases to cover everything well, from Vladivostok to Kamchatka. Russian planes on the average have a shorter range, and Russia is far behind in aerial tanker capability. Its fleet could extend their fighters' range by some 50% for some 200-ish fighters, while the US tanker fleet could offer the same or greater range extension for its entire combat fleet. So even though Kamchatka is far away from the original goal, air superiority would likely be achieved, eventually. It would not come easy, of course. Russia has plenty of air defense systems. On paper, it has all this, and a lot of these systems are quite modern and capable. But they're also scattered all around Russia. A lot would need to stay along the western Russian borders and protect the important sites deeper inside Russia, as the US would still likely poke and prod with its air forces in Europe. A lot, perhaps even more than half if need be, might be hauled over to the east. But that takes time. Bringing whole regiments of SAMs to Kamchatka takes either planes, which would be threatened in the air, or ships, which may also be threatened by the US Navy. Road and rail infrastructure in the Russian Far East is not diverse and would be constantly attacked. Moving too many SAMs around the Okhotsk Sea and Kamchatka, for example, might mean there is not enough SAMs for the Kuril Islands, Sakhalin, or even the crucial port of Vladivostok. So the US is likely to eventually, after some half a year of constant pressure, take at least some foothold in the area, be it Kurils, southern Kamchatka, or at the very least coastal Chukotka regions. Could the Russian Navy stop the incursion? Likely not. It is smaller and less advanced, even in nominal tally. To note, vessels in multi-year overhauls, like some carriers, are not included in the lists. But Russian ships are divided in fleets that would take weeks to assemble, if the US let them. Realistically, the Russian Black Sea and Baltic Sea fleet could never hope to sail out and connect with the other fleets. Even the Russian North Fleet could be unlikely to meet with the Pacific Fleet at the time of their choosing. Besides suffering the issue of polar ice slowing down travel during a few months per year, the Northern Fleet would likely be stopped and intercepted somewhere in the Bering Sea. At best, Russia could try to time the attack with the Pacific Fleet from the other side. But given the flexibility that air power provides, the US ample carrier advantage and many more fast nuclear subs ambushing the fast-moving Russians, which would be pressed for time, the two Russian fleets would likely get attacked piecemeal, except for submarines which might get a chance to slip through. You can learn more about the distances and Russian Navy woes in our previous video, Russia versus Japan. Russian ships and subs are for the most part still not as advanced, with most of their large ships still stuck in Cold War era technology, and their ships are short on long-range air defenses, which would be desperately needed against US airstrikes. Getting a foothold in the Far East would not be quick, and Russian coastal anti-ship batteries, submarine ambushes, and whatever air force the Russians can muster would sink possibly dozens of US naval assets. But ultimately, as most of the US Atlantic Fleet vessels join in, a secure perimeter would be established somewhere, and airborne and amphibious landings would be performed. The US does have nearby islands which would also get used as stepping stones for the invasion. Russian commander islands would also quickly fall to the US. But all of those northern areas can be very inhospitable. 6 to 7 months out of the year, those areas are under snow cover. The average winter temperature is below freezing. A summer push might be more likely, as temperatures are acceptable then. So the US would eventually be able to move tons of troops to Kamchatka, but it would need to build the infrastructure for literally hundreds of thousands of troops. In such an environment, it would cost a fortune and take easily a year. Then another round of amphibious assaults on Sakhalin might be easier and faster than a slow land route push towards Vladivostok. Due to a different microclimate, the temperatures there are even lower in the winter, dropping to -17 degrees Celsius. Waging war in such conditions would wreak havoc on soldiers' morale, even if their side would be mostly winning. Russia would likely go all in to protect Vladivostok though. While the US would have more troops and total air supremacy, US supply lines would be immense and would have to cross the Pacific Ocean. Morale would possibly be on the Russian side, but Russian-owned supplies would be constantly attacked by the US air power. Let's step back to look at the big picture. When it comes to overall troop numbers, the US clearly has more. Counting troops isn't always straightforward, as the US and Russia count them differently. Russia counts a lot of stuff in separate commands, which the US has under any one of the three main branches. So counting the actual troops on the ground will yield different results. And the US has a lot more robust reserve components. While its National Guard members are part-time warriors, they still train several weeks per year. Russia doesn't have anything directly comparable, though it does have its National Guard. It's a different kind of force though. It's part professional, part conscript, and it's basically a parallel army formation. Compared to the Russian army, it's lightly equipped as it's meant to be an internal peacekeeping force. Still, National and Board Guard services do have armored vehicles. Russian reserve units are very small. The law stipulates 2 million troops in the reserve, but that's a paper number. Most people on the reservist list did not see any training and have left the army years ago. The reserves that actually get at least some training per year offer only a token force. In 2012, the reserve force was founded, but so far mere thousands were called upon to train. Allegedly, equipment for some 13 reservist brigades is being maintained though, so 100,000 overall personnel to fight and support those brigades might be plausible upon mobilization. The US also has reserves for the other branches, which Russia more or less lacks. Nominally speaking, Russian ground-based firepower is immense, rivaling the US one, even though troop numbers are smaller. Russia has through decades relied more on ground-based firepower than air support. Attack helicopter numbers favor the US though. While most of the cruise missiles would be used in the opening stages of the war, some would still be peppering Russians even years after the start of the war. Russia would likely be on a constant defensive. Eventually, a push from Sakhalin and from the north would cut off Vladivostok. Depending on the morale factor, the US might even eventually take the city and try to continue towards the west. But that's a huge land to cross. The distance shown is the straightest one, which would take the troops through thick, freezing forests in the winter. And even in the summer, the lack of infrastructure would make any advance excruciatingly slow. The actual distance by road, closer to the Mongolian and Kazakh borders, where it's also warmer, would be even longer. And during all that time, the US would have to be attacking, facing Russians hidden in forests, ready for ambushes. Even if the US morale would not be seriously chipped during the initial landings on the Far East, it would surely take hard hits during a years-long advance towards Moscow. Added serious issue as US pushes westward would be ever longer US supply lines through cold Siberia, and ever shorter supply lines easier to upkeep for Russia. In such an environment and circumstances, the US would likely be losing more soldiers than Russia, and the war would at some point grow so unpopular back in the US that the US would simply have to stop. Borders would be redrawn, and it's likely there would be years before anyone had any appetite for a continuation of the conflict. So this fantastical scenario that forces the US to attack Russia even though stripped of its most powerful weapon, which is its worldwide influence on other countries, would not end well for the US. It would ultimately suffer more casualties. It would lose as many ships as Russia and easily more planes through the years. But given the large starting numbers, the US would still be left with a navy and some air force, while those Russian branches would be more or less obliterated, and Russia would be left without a presence on the Pacific, which is crucial to it. In that regard, the US would be the victor, but having paid a brutal cost, with casualties rivaling ones from the World War II. Back in the real world, none of this would ever transpire. If the US could not get other European countries to join in the war and could not get its own troops to advance into Ukraine and Russia through NATO countries' territory, no massive land attack on Russia would ever be attempted. Before we go, here's another look at Conflict of Nations gameplay. As you can see, there's a bunch of stuff simulated in-game. There are routes to plan, morale to take into account, and mobilization times to think of. And just look at all these units to play with. Or research trees, like this one. As Russia, see how invading Ukraine might go, for starters. Or experience the issues of going over the Atlantic, as playing the US. Conflict of Nation games can take weeks to complete, as the PvP environment can be quite challenging. Join a huge community of millions of players in the game and Discord. Use your diplomacy skills and forge alliances with other players. So click on the link in the video description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Offer is available for 30 days only, but your country might need your strategy skills right now. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.